There are moments in life that stay with you, not because you choose to keep them, but because they carved themselves so deeply into who you are that no amount of time, no number of years, no distance traveled could ever fully wash them away. You know the kind of moments I'm talking about. The ones that wake you up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, and for just a split second you're back there again, in that dark place, in that cold night, with that feeling crawling up your spine like something cold and deliberate. Tonight, I want to take you to those places. I want to walk you through the kind of stories that ordinary people, real people, people just like you and me, carry with them for decades. Stories they whisper about around campfires, stories they tell only to their closest friends, and sometimes stories they've never told anyone at all until now. What you're about to hear is a collection of experiences that span across forests, mountains, rivers, deserts, and dark country roads. Each one belongs to a real person who at some point in their life came face to face with something they could not explain. Some of them tried to find logical answers. Some of them gave up trying. But every single one of them was changed, permanently, deeply, and irreversibly changed by what they encountered. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull that blanket a little closer. Because once we begin, I promise you, the darkness outside your window is going to feel just a little bit thicker than it did before. And if you're joining us for the first time tonight, welcome. We are so glad you found your way here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story. This community is warm, it is wonderful, and trust me, you are going to want to stay. Now let us begin. Our first story comes from someone who was just 11 years old when it happened. And they want you to understand something before the story even starts. The fact that they remember every detail of this night, more than 40 years later, should tell you everything you need to know about how deeply it affected them. This person grew up in a family where sensitivity, what some might call a kind of quiet intuition, a heightened awareness of things unseen, was fairly common. For most members of the family, it was something that faded naturally as they grew older. By the time most of them were 10 or 11, that extra sensitivity had already begun to soften and quiet down on its own. But not for this person. Even now, decades later, they carry a sharper awareness of the world around them than most people do. They still pick up on things that others simply don't notice. Back then, as a child, that sensitivity was at its strongest, and on this particular night it may have saved 10 young lives. Now a bit of background. Their mother had throughout their childhood moved from one religion to another, what they affectionately describe as a kind of spiritual musical chairs. And when this person turned 10 years old, their mother landed on a new chair, the Mormon faith. The people were kind, warm, and welcoming for the most part. But this narrator is very honest. They are not a religious person, and they never have been. Faith has simply never been the path they walked. Still, when their mother signed them up for the church summer camp and announced she would be attending as a counselor, there wasn't much room to argue. And so, off they went. Now, as anyone who has ever been to a summer camp knows, and I mean any summer camp, anywhere in the world, there is always a ghost story. It is practically a requirement, a tradition as old as campfires and s'mores, and this camp was no different. The story that was passed around the camp told of a young man whose spirit still haunted the woods nearby. According to the tale, he had drowned after falling from an old dock out on the river, a dock that sat just a short distance into the trees. His ghost, the story went, still wandered those woods. And so, as 11 and 12-year-old girls are perfectly designed to do, this person and their 9 cabin mates cooked up a plan. On the last night of camp, they were going to sneak out. They were going to go look for that ghost. Nobody genuinely expected to find anything. That was never really the point. The point was the thrill of it, the delicious preteen rush of doing something forbidden, something spooky, something they absolutely were not supposed to do. So at around 10:30 that night, an hour and a half after lights out at 9, all 10 girls slipped out through the back window of their cabin. One flashlight between them. No map, no plan, no idea which direction they were even heading. As you might imagine, they were hopelessly lost within minutes. Picture it for a moment, 10 young girls, 11 and 12 years old, stumbling through dark woods at night, each one trying to scare the others while secretly being terrified herself. When they had left the cabin, there had been a beautiful, near-full moon lighting up the sky. But not long after they entered the woods, the moon slipped behind the clouds. And just like that, the world went very, very dark. One flashlight was nowhere near enough. As the weight of their situation began to settle over them, as each of them slowly and quietly realized that this incredibly fun idea had not actually been a very smart idea. The woods around them began to feel different, strange, heavy with something they could not name. To keep everyone together, they decided to walk in a single line, each girl resting her hands on the shoulders of the girl in front of her. The narrator, being the one who had thought to bring the flashlight, took the front position. And so they began to walk, or rather, to wander, in what they hoped was the general direction of camp. That was when it happened for the first time. The narrator felt it, not a thought exactly, but something stronger, a feeling deep and certain pulling at them. And then, as clear as if someone were standing right beside them, they heard a voice, a male voice, calm, steady, close. "That way isn't safe, go right." There were 10 girls out there in those woods, all of them young, not a single male voice in the group, and yet the voice had been unmistakably, undeniably there. The narrator paused. They did not say anything to the others, not yet, but they trusted it. There was something about that voice, something in the quality of it that felt reliable, safe in some hard-to-explain way, and so quietly, without explanation, they began to steer the group. The voice came again, and again. The third time it spoke, the narrator finally told the others what they had been hearing. Chaos followed, as you can probably imagine. 20 minutes of terrified shrieking and wide-eyed panic from 10 girls who had just been told their navigator was following directions from a disembodied male voice in the middle of a dark forest. But panic, no matter how loud, eventually runs out of steam. And when it did, the girls came back to the only truth that mattered. They needed to get back to camp. They lined back up, hands on shoulders, and began walking again. And then something new began to happen. The narrator continued to hear the voice and feel its guidance. But the other girls started experiencing something too. Not a voice, none of them heard that. What they felt was different. A hand. Just the gentle, unmistakable pressure of a hand on one shoulder or the other, giving a soft and steady nudge left or right. A guidance. A correction of direction. And here is what is important to understand. It was not just one girl feeling this at a time. It moved through the line. One after another, each girl would feel that gentle push, and then the next, and then the next. Like a ripple moving down the chain of 10 small bodies moving through the dark. Not a shove, not something frightening in its force, just a firm, careful, guiding pressure. This happened dozens of times. Over the course of several long hours as they wandered through those dark woods, every single one of them felt those hands at least 24 times. At around 4 in the morning, they were finally found by camp staff and guided back to safety. All 10 girls arrived in a state of complete and utter hysteria. One of the counselors had to sit them all down and spend considerable time just calming them before they could even begin to piece the story together into anything coherent. Now, if the story ended there, you might find it unsettling, perhaps even moving. But you might also, in the clear light of morning, find a way to rationalize it. A shared hallucination, the power of suggestion, the overactive imaginations of tired, frightened children. It's the kind of story that can be gently set aside. Except what happened the next day made it impossible to set aside, ever. The group was not scheduled to leave camp until 4 in the afternoon. The girls were allowed to sleep in until lunchtime, exhausted as they were, having not slept a single minute the previous night, their bodies and minds worn completely through. But after lunch, rather than simply being scolded and left to wait for departure, they were told they would be going back into the woods. The counselors had questions. They wanted to understand what had happened. And so the girls were led back out, and they walked the exact same path they had traveled in the dark. At first, the path was scattered and seemingly random, because it had been. They had just been 10 lost girls stumbling through the trees. But as they followed the trail they had left behind, the direction became undeniably clear. They had been walking straight toward a cliff. A cliff with a 40-foot drop down to the river below. The marks in the earth showed that the group had been heading directly for that cliff's edge, and that they had stopped and turned sharply to the right approximately 10 feet before they would have gone over. They followed the path further. It ran parallel to the cliff for nearly half a mile, sloping gently downward before leading them to the river's edge. They could hear the water they had been able to hear it the night before too, and had known they were close. But in the darkness they had never seen it. And then they saw where their path had taken them. An old dock stretched out over the water. Not a small dock, nothing like the modest little pier they had imagined from the ghost story. This was enormous. The size of half a football field stretched out lengthwise, and it was rotted, deeply, dangerously rotted. The wood was broken through in dozens of places. Entire sections had given way. It was, in the full honesty of daylight, a death trap. The 10 girls had walked across it in the dark, every single one of them, and not one of them had even known they were on a dock. But that was not the most astonishing part. The path they had walked across that dock was not a straight line. You could see it clearly in the daylight, the scuff marks on the old wood, tracing a weaving, winding route that moved around every rotted section, every collapsed board, every gaping hole. The path they had walked, guided by invisible hands in total darkness, had traced the only safe route across that entire structure. 150 feet of rotting wood, 10 young girls, not one stumble, not one fall. The hands had kept them alive. Most of the counselors did not believe the story. They called it extraordinary luck and left it at that. The girls' parents would be notified of the unauthorized midnight excursion and would determine the appropriate punishment. The narrator's mother was, perhaps, the one exception. She listened to the story with something quieter and more open in her eyes. The narrator never returned to that camp, and they never crossed paths with any of the other 9 girls again, since none of them attended the same church. But they have carried this story for over 40 years, and now so will you. If a story like this touches something in you, if you've ever had a moment where you felt guided by something you couldn't explain, please share it in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Our next story comes from someone who was a teenager at the time, and it happened on a long night drive through the remote northern woods of Maine. The narrator and their mother were traveling together, cutting through miles of timberland on a back highway, the kind of road that people only take when they have no other choice. Small logging towns were spaced hours apart from each other, and between them there was nothing but dark forest pressing in from both sides of the road. The weather had turned against them that night. Rain was coming down in heavy sheets. The temperature had dropped sharply, and a low, cold mist had settled over the ground. Spruce and pine trees crowded close to the roadside, so tall and tightly packed that the headlights barely reached past the first line of trunks. For nearly 40 miles, they had not passed a single other vehicle. About halfway between 2 small towns, the road curved and ran alongside an old, overgrown logging trail disappearing into the trees. Somewhere out in the dark, a narrow creek ran unseen. And then the narrator saw someone standing at the edge of the road. At first, they thought it was a road sign, a trick of the rain and the headlights and the dark. But as the car drew closer, the shape became unmistakably human. A man, standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe a foot from the asphalt, angled toward the road as though he were about to step directly into their path. The narrator felt their stomach drop. He was wearing a dark green canvas jacket, soaked through completely, and muddy jeans tucked into heavy work boots. The clothes looked old, the kind of worn, sturdy clothing a logger might wear. They hung stiff and waterlogged on his frame as the rain poured over him. He was not moving. As the headlights swept across him fully, the narrator saw his face. And that was when the understanding hit them like a physical blow. The entire left side of the man's face was destroyed. Not bruised, not cut, destroyed. The skin was torn and open, crushed in a way that suggested tremendous impact. His jaw hung at a wrong angle on that side. Dark blood had soaked through the collar of his jacket and spread across his chest. The left side of his torso, under the fabric, looked flat and broken in a way that simply was not natural. The narrator's first thought, awful as it was roadkill. The injuries looked like what you see on the road when something has been struck at high speed. But the strangest element was not the injuries, it was his expression. He was not panicking, he was not reaching out for help, he was not reacting at all to the truck driving toward him through the rain. He was simply watching, staring with a perfectly blank face. His eyes tracked the vehicle as it passed, slowly, steadily, the way someone might watch a distant thing they have no real connection to. For one single second, the headlights lit up his face completely. The narrator saw the rain hitting his ruined cheek and running through the blood on that destroyed side of his head. And then the car was past him. The narrator spun immediately in their seat to look through the rear window. The shoulder of the road was empty. A cold wave of panic moved through them, slow and deliberate, rising from the feet upward. They asked their mother, voice tight, if she had seen the man. She was quiet for a moment, then she said yes. They slowed the car. Both of them watched the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure stumble onto the road behind them. But the road behind them was dark and empty and stayed that way. The narrator's mother had ridden motorcycles for most of her adult life. She knows what happens to a human body in a high-speed crash. After several silent minutes, she said what both of them had been thinking. The injuries on that man looked exactly like the damage caused by being thrown across pavement at speed. A motorcycle crash, the kind that does not have survivors. They searched for years afterward, looking for any record of a fatal accident on that stretch of road. They never found anything. Our next story takes us to a quiet lakeside cottage in a small town in northern Ontario, Canada. The narrator had taken a seasonal job opportunity in a place called Muskoka, a quaint, peaceful town surrounded by forest, and had been set up in a cottage owned by their employer. The cottage was shared with 3 other employees, nestled among trees with other cottages scattered sporadically across the surrounding land. The property itself was split between 2 levels. The upper section sat perched on a rock face, accessible by a long flight of stairs that led down to the lower section right along the edge of a beautiful local lake. Down on that lower level, there was a boathouse and nearby small separate building that housed a sauna. After long days of work from sunrise to dusk, the sauna had become a beloved ritual for the group. The routine was simple and deeply satisfying: heat up in the sauna until thoroughly warm, step out into the cool night air, walk down to the lake to cool off, and then step back into the heat again. With the lake sitting just in front of the sauna door, it was the perfect way to unwind. One evening, the narrator arrived back at the cottage around 11 at night, feeling more physically stiff and achy than usual. They decided that tonight was a sauna night. They asked their roommates if anyone wanted to join, but the others had decided to stay in and have some drinks together. No hard feelings. The narrator grabbed their swimming gear and a towel, headed down the long flight of stairs past the boathouse, and arrived at the sauna alone. They turned on the heat, settled in, and let the steam slowly work through their tired muscles. After about 10 minutes of deep, good heat, stoking the rocks with water to build the steam, they decided it was time for the cool-off dip in the lake. They opened the sauna door. The warm glow of the lamp lit the path ahead. They walked down toward the dark water and stepped in slowly, the lake a little cool against their skin that night. When they reached about knee-deep, the night was suddenly split open by a sound. A long, drawn-out whistle, loud and clear. The narrator froze. Every hair on their body stood straight up. They scanned the tree line, the darkness, the small circle of sauna light behind them. Nothing, just trees and dark and silence. Their mind worked quickly through the rational options. A local animal, maybe, or more likely, one of their roommates out here trying to give them a good scare for a laugh. They pushed the feeling down, chose the logical answer, and whistled back. Their own tone, a simple response into the dark. The whistle came back immediately. Exactly the same tone, exactly the same cadence, not a hint of difference. The narrator paused, an animal they had reasoned earlier, but an animal does not do that. An animal does not perfectly match a human tone and rhythm with that kind of precision. So it had to be one of the roommates, right? Had to be. To test it, the narrator whistled again, but this time they made it strange. Irregular. A weird, scattered little melody with no clear pattern. The response was instant. The exact same strange melody came back from the tree line. Not a single beat missed, and this time the sound was closer than before. The cold that washed over the narrator at that moment was nothing like the temperature of the lake water. It went all the way through them, reaching places that had nothing to do with the physical world. Every hair, every nerve, every instinct they possessed screamed the same single message. Leave. Now. They did not wait. They did not collect their towel. They ran. Up the stairs, back into the cottage, and there sat every single one of their roommates, exactly where they had been left, gathered around the table with their drinks, not one of them having moved an inch. The silence that fell over the room after the narrator asked if anyone had been outside told them everything. In the weeks following, the narrator did research. They searched for explanations, and they found something that made the hair rise on their arms all over again. There is an old and widely held warning across many cultures, particularly in the folklore of the indigenous peoples of parts of North America, about answering whistles in the dark, specifically about whistling into the woods at night and having something whistle back. The narrator had not known, now they do. And now so do you. Our next story is older than the others. Much, much older. It comes from someone living in the Western Balkans who heard it from an elderly relative. A story passed down through family memory, and one that also exists, apparently, in the written record. A Serbian army officer who was present at the events wrote them down in a journal that is today preserved in a museum in western Serbia. This is the story of an Austro-Hungarian soldier named Johan, and it takes place during World War I at the battle on Mount Sur. In Johan's own words, as recorded and passed down, his unit had been advancing from the Drina River, hauling heavy artillery, howitzers, up a steep hill that the Serbian soldiers called the Eagle's Nest. When they reached the top, they could see open meadows below, which told them villages were nearby. Their command post was set up along the edge of one of those clearings, where tall turkey oak trees offered shade from the heavy August sun. Johan was looking for a fellow soldier named France, who had gone to carry a stack of potatoes to the field kitchen. When he heard it, a faint, distant sound, a soft whump from somewhere far off. The first artillery shell landed among their positions, right beside the horses and draft oxen. The Serbian scouts had found them. The second shell hit near the command tent. The third, Johan does not remember where it landed, only that it was close to him and that the force of it threw him into a nearby creek. When he regained consciousness, it was dark. He was badly concussed. He had no sense of direction, no landmarks he could recognize, and no way to locate his unit. All around him were the sounds of night, the call of an owl somewhere in the trees, the soft movement of wind through the branches overhead. He does not know how long he followed the creek downstream. Eventually, in the darkness, he spotted something near a large, pale stone, an old watermill. The structure had a moss-covered hip roof and looked as though it had not been used since the days of the Ottoman Empire. The millstone was silent. Nothing was turning. Inside, there was a stone sleeping platform directly opposite the entrance, with the millstone resting beside it. A small three-legged wooden stool stood near the remains of what had once been a campsite. The wooden ceiling was low, low enough that Johan muttered to himself that he should have climbed up onto the roof to sleep instead. He built a small fire on the floor and sat with it. The pain from his concussion pulled at him, and the crackle of the fire was hypnotic. Sometime after midnight, he fell asleep. He woke to something poking at the flames. Still groggy, eyes barely open, he assumed at first it was debris from the shelling, some trick of his damaged mind. Then he opened both eyes fully. Crouched near the fire, staring into the flames, was a young woman. Black hair, a black military coat he had never seen the like of before. She paid no attention to him. She simply stared into the fire. Something in Johan's gut clenched immediately. Something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. He reached for a broken chair leg and pretended to tend the fire, moving slowly, calmly, waiting until the wood had heated to a bright, burning glow. Then he shoved it beneath the hem of her coat. She leapt back, and as she did, her coat lifted, and Johan saw what was beneath it. Goat legs, black hooves. She let out a sound that he described as somewhere between the cry of a newborn baby and laughter. Then she ran from the mill, cursing at him as she went. In his own language. Johan fled the mill himself, scrambling uphill in a blind panic, away from the water and the dark structure. He ran until he stumbled directly into a Serbian ambush position. After that, he remembered nothing. He had been shot in the stomach. He collapsed. He was eventually transported to a Serbian field hospital where he recovered. He was later exchanged as a prisoner of war, and it was during that time in the field hospital that he shared this story for the first time. This next story is much more recent. In fact, the person who shared it said it happened just this week. They took their son and their son's friend on a planned 3-day hiking trip along the Laurel Highlands hiking trail in Pennsylvania, a beautiful stretch of trail that winds through some of the most quietly stunning wilderness in the northeastern United States. For the two boys, it was their very first overnight hiking experience, and the excitement in the group was real and contagious. They made it to the first night's shelter just before dark, good timing, just barely. They got a campfire going in front of the shelter, which had a fireplace and chimney built into the front of the 3-walled structure. No other hikers were on the trail. No one else had reserved a spot at the campsite. So they settled in comfortably, fire going, dinner eaten, some music playing softly as the night came in around them. That was when the narrator heard it for the first time. A knocking sound, heavy and deliberate like someone swinging a thick branch against the trunk of a tree. It came from out in the dark, at least several hundred yards away. The second knock came closer. The narrator's son heard that one too. The hair on the back of the narrator's neck rose up. They went still and quiet and listened. The boys eventually dozed off. The narrator could hear the soft rhythm of their breathing, the light sounds of sleep. But the knocking continued, sometimes with just a few minutes between strikes, sometimes with as much as 10. And after a while, the narrator began to hear something new, what sounded like a small sapling being shaken or struck near the edge of the camp. They swept their bright flashlight across the trees in every direction. Nothing. They began to relax, and then it started again. The same pattern, but now the sound was below them, down on the ridge. The narrator repositioned their body so they could watch. Both sides of the chimney at once. One of the boys shifted in their sleep, making a sound against their sleeping pad. Whatever was out in the darkness beyond the shelter heard it immediately. There was movement, something taking off, retreating quickly. Again, the flashlight found nothing. This pattern repeated itself twice more through the long hours of the night. The narrator did not sleep until the sky began to lighten at dawn. When the alarm went off in the morning, the son's friend stumbled awake in a daze and said he thought he had seen the shape of someone standing next to the fireplace. By the time he reached for his light, the shape was gone. He had fallen asleep before the first knock and had no idea anything had happened through the night. The narrator is careful and honest in their thinking. They have heard raccoons before. They know what animals sound like. They are not quick to jump to conclusions. But they are equally honest about the other truth. Something deep and ancient inside them had responded to that first knock with pure, primal alarm. They had their headlamp on and their glasses on and their pistol ready within seconds. There are stories in that part of Pennsylvania going back centuries. Stories about something large, something that knocks, something that moves through the dark without being seen. The narrator does not say what it was. They only say they will never forget how the back of their neck felt at that first sound. Have you ever had an experience in the wilderness that you couldn't explain? Share it in the comments. We read every single one, and your story matters. Our next story moves all the way to the high northern region of India, a place called Ladakh, tucked up in the Himalayas with disputed borders touching both China and Tibet. Remote, breathtaking, and as it turns out, deeply unsettling in ways the narrator did not expect. This person was around 10 years old at the time, traveling with their family to visit relatives in this extraordinarily isolated part of the world. The area where they were staying was rural and elevated, perched on a mountaintop with forested mountain slopes stretching out in nearly every direction. No light pollution, no traffic, just the pure, dark sky and the cold, clean air and the overwhelming sense of nature in its most ancient and undisturbed form. The first couple of nights, the narrator slept extraordinarily well, the kind of sleep they say they have never quite replicated since. The day before the main encounter, the family went hiking in the Himalayan range. The sky was clear to start. Visibility was excellent. The weather was manageable, it was summer, and the air was cold but not brutal. The first stretch of the hike was genuinely beautiful. Open views, breathtaking scenery, the kind of landscape that makes you stop walking just to absorb it. They reached a flat section of the trail, and then the sky shifted. Clouds began to build. Some members of the group wanted to turn back. The group pushed forward. Within minutes, rain started, cold, icy, hard-edged rain, and then hail, the kind that grows larger even as you stand there watching it. Everyone scattered for cover. The narrator, by their own description the smallest and scrawniest in the group, wedged themselves under a massive rock formation, something almost like a shallow cave. The overhang was shaped in a way that concealed the opening from the outside. The narrator noticed almost immediately that the floor inside the opening was completely dry. Strange, given how strong the wind was. The rain and hail should have blown straight in, but the ground inside was not wet. And then came the feeling. That specific crawling awareness that something was wrong. That particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Every hair standing up, something in the gut twisting. The narrator had assumed when they pressed into the crack that it was too low and too narrow for anything else to fit. But looking further in, they realized the opening went much deeper into the rock than they had first understood. Whatever had been in there, whatever had been sheltering in that dry, concealed space, had left recently. The silence and the dryness and that feeling all pointed to the same thing. This had been someone else's hiding spot. The narrator scrambled back out into the hail without looking back. They said nothing about it to the family. They knew they would be scolded for going in there alone. But they felt sick and strange for the rest of that day and chalked it up to the altitude. Then came the night. It was around 1 in the morning. The narrator's sister had gone to sleep. It was just the narrator and their father, neither of them tired yet. The father asked a simple question: did they want to go stargazing? For a child who had grown up city-bound, obsessed with constellations and black holes and the deep reaches of space, this was not a question that required any thought. They walked a few yards from the house, just enough to escape the small pool of light that would have dimmed the sky. To the left of the house there was an opening, a narrow path that led to the edge of the mountain with low shrubs on either side. At the end of the path, the view was completely unobstructed. No trees, no light, just the full, overwhelming sky above them and the drop of the mountain below. It was completely silent. No wind, no insects, no crickets, just the soft sound of gravel under their feet. The narrator was deep in the sky, counting constellations, finding familiar patterns, and had barely noticed the silence settling over everything when it happened. A rustling from the bushes on the right side of the path. Both the narrator and their father stopped. The father turned the flashlight toward the bush. Something looked back at them. The narrator's brain, operating at child speed and in the darkness, registered dog. But it was not a dog. The face was too human, deeply unsettlingly human. The kind of human that the face of an animal should not be able to achieve. And the eyes, when the flashlight hit it, there was no eye shine, no reflection, just two flat, matte, dark pits where the light simply stopped. The narrator reached their hand out instinctively, the animal-loving part of their brain still trying to override the fear. The creature shifted forward. And in that movement, more of it became visible. The proportions were wrong. The joints in the legs sat too high. The neck was too long. The fur was slick, so uniformly slick that it looked less like fur and more like skin with a fine covering of something dark. The father's hand came down firmly on the narrator's shoulder. One word: stop. The narrator turned to look at them and stopped speaking when they saw their father's face. Pale, ashen, uneasy in a way the narrator had never witnessed in this person before. This was not parental caution about a stray dog. This was genuine fear. "Don't pet that thing." The narrator turned back slowly. The creature was retreating into the bushes. But as it did, its eyes remained fixed on the narrator's eyes, not the quick, flicking gaze of a frightened or aggressive animal, not the scanning look of something assessing a threat. A direct, steady, locked gaze, the kind of eye contact that even humans rarely hold. The father turned off the flashlight, and in that same instant the creature was gone. They stood for a long moment in the dark, waiting for it to come back. It did not. But here is the detail that sits at the center of everything. There was nowhere for it to go. The path ended at a cliff drop. On either side of the path were low, dense bushes backed by other houses. A creature that size could not have climbed down a steep mountain face in silence. It could not have vanished into the bushes without sound. It simply was not there anymore. The narrator has been to India many times. They have never encountered anything like it before or since. If you have, especially in that region, they very much want to hear from you. Our next story comes from someone who went camping at Garner State Park along the Frio River in Texas, and they've been carrying this experience for years. They were young and foolish by their own admission, drinking, being reckless, and setting up camp near the river directly below the old Baldy Cliffs. Other campers warned them. The spirits of this land, those campers said, are protective. Treat it with respect. They did not listen. They chopped into a tree with a hatchet, not for any reason, just because they could. They left trash scattered around. They treated a sacred and storied place like it had no history, no weight, no significance. And that night something responded. It began with shadows against the wall of the tent. There was no logical light source strong enough to cast shadows. And yet outside, the air had taken on a strange, cold glow, pale and still and somehow purposeful. Through the thin nylon wall of the tent, the narrator saw shapes. Small shapes, perhaps 3 feet in height, thick and powerfully built, with a deep, dramatic hunch to their posture. They were covered in dense, matted hair that looked ancient, like something that had been growing for a very long time. and they were moving in a circle around the tent. Not walking, rising and falling, a rhythmic, deliberate up and down motion, almost like a slow, predatory bounce. And as they moved, they were chanting. A low, guttural, repetitive sound that the narrator could not understand, not any language they had ever heard. Then they began touching the tent, pressing into the fabric, pushing so hard that the nylon was physically making contact with the friend's head inside. The two of them were terrified beyond articulation. Every time they unzipped the tent to shout at whatever was outside, the campsite was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Shadows gone. Sounds gone. The second the zipper ran back up, the shadows returned. The chanting returned. The rising and falling returned. One of the shapes appeared to be holding a stick, and around its thick, hunched neck, the narrator saw what looked like a necklace made of bone. The next morning, they packed up and left. They have since read about the Comanche legends of the limestone canyons of the Texas Hill Country, stories of small, powerful rock people who guard these places with fierce protectiveness. They believe them now. The next account comes from a group of friends who stopped to explore Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, a place with a history heavy enough to feel physical when you stand near it. Brushy Mountain is an enormous structure. Gray concrete pressed hard against the mountain behind it, wrapped in thick Tennessee woodland. The trees and hills around it breathe and move with life. And then there is this massive, still, man-made weight sitting among them, wrong in its shape, wrong in its stillness. There were no tour or events that day, and the place felt quiet when the group arrived. They parked and walked toward the building. The courtyard gate was open. No signs told them to stay out. They went in. Two men were in the courtyard throwing a ball for a large dog. Nothing seemed unusual until the dog wandered over to them, and one of the men followed. He pressed them immediately on why they were there, whether they were part of a tour, and once he understood they were simply curious visitors, his manner changed. He said he was contracted by the owner to do some work there. He did not say what the work was, or explain why the gate was left open. He told them they were not supposed to be there, and they left respectfully. Not long after, a white crossover pulled directly up to them in the lot. A woman and a child were inside. She got out and immediately pushed the group toward the exit. Her manner was sharp and dismissive. The narrator's friend pushed back. They still left. As they went, the woman followed them and locked the parking lot gate behind them. Outside, they checked the public rules. They were legally allowed to be there. It was a commonly visited location. So they came back that night. They parked in the outer lot and waited in the dark. A truck drove slowly the full length of the road up to the prison and back again. It did not see them. They decided to go on foot up the grassy hill beside the road, staying out of the parking lot lights, to look around from above. At intervals, a bright light swept up into the sky from somewhere within the prison. The sound of what might have been a dirt bike echoed off the surrounding hills and then cut out. And then they heard screaming. Distant, fearful, it happened twice. They stood very still and whispered among themselves. Maybe there was a tour happening, someone else on the grounds. Standing there in the dark, they noticed something close to them that they had not seen before. A wild pig. It shifted and started moving toward them. The narrator's friend grabbed them both without hesitation and pulled them away. They ran back to the car. Convinced now that the prison must be active with some kind of event, they drove back indirectly. As they passed the road, they saw the same truck parked to the side. The child in the back was pointing a flashlight up into the sky. There was the light they had been seeing. The man was running a chainsaw behind the truck. The woman was in her crossover watching the road. She moved immediately to block them, rolled down her window, threatened to call the police, said she knew the owner but would not provide a name or a number. They called the police themselves when they left. The officers confirmed they had every right to be there but advised against returning that night, said it might not be safe. They never found out what those people were doing. None of it taken piece by piece would have meant much, but taken all together in the dark against the weight of that place, it added up to something that stayed with them. This next story is brief and strange, and oddly beautiful in its own unsettling way. A person and their partner went for a late-night walk, around 2 in the morning under a full moon, along an old railroad trail that had been the site of a major collision back in the 1800s. Many people died there, and the history of the place is known locally. They had been walking for about 30 minutes when they came across a house. That alone was strange. They were in the middle of the woods, but the house was old, entirely wooden inside and out, completely empty of furniture or possessions. No television, no bookshelves, nothing personal. The narrator said it felt staged. Their partner said it reminded them of old mountain railroad workers' cabins. Next to the house was a large metal garage. No vehicles visible. While they stood there taking it in, the smell came. Alcohol, heavy, sharp, unmistakable. The kind of smell that hits you in the face and stays there. And it appeared from nowhere. They had already been standing there for several minutes without it. It was as though it arrived with intention. It smelled, the narrator said, like being yelled at by a very drunk old man. Up close and immediate. The hair on their necks rose. The dizziness came over both of them at once. He took her hand. They ran. 20 feet down the trail, the sound of a gun being cocked. Then a wooden door kicked open with force. Every time they stopped moving, the smell began to creep back in. They wonder sometimes if it was a spirit. Someone who had worked that rail line a century and a half ago and had never fully let go of the place. Someone who valued his privacy, even across the border of death. They may never find the house again, given the turns they took and the private trails they crossed to get there. They're not entirely sure it was the kind of place that stays in one spot. And now we come to one of the most quietly layered stories in tonight's collection. It comes from a couple who spent about a week in a rental house in Joshua Tree, just south of the park itself, at the base of a massive rock formation. They knew the area well, 4 or 5 previous visits between them. They are not people who spook easily in the desert. But this house felt different from the moment they arrived. Neither of them said anything at first. They unpacked. They settled in. The feeling was just slightly off, like a low note playing underneath everything else. Then around 10 o'clock that night, the feeling changed. It didn't stay slightly off. It became heavy, pressing, the specific quality of air that makes you feel watched. They went to bed. The morning felt fine. They went about their day, came home as the sun set. Dinner, and then 10 o'clock again, and the shift happened again precisely like something keeping to a schedule. This time the narrator couldn't sleep. Their partner went to bed. The narrator stayed up in the living room, writing and scrolling through their phone in the heavy quiet of the house. At 3 in the morning, a whistle. Not the sound of wind, not ambiguous. A whistle shaped by lips, deliberate in tone, at least 6 full seconds long. A melody. It came from directly outside the living room window, close enough that when tested the next morning it had to have been within 15 feet of the glass. The narrator sat up with their pistol and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, no footprints in the sand outside. But on the opposite side of the house, large paw prints, not quite right. No clear back leg prints, as though whatever made them was moving in a perfectly synchronized gait, stepping into its own tracks. The prints came down out of the rock hills behind the house, went directly to the side door of the bedroom, and then simply stopped. And then a roadrunner appeared. Just appeared the way things in stories sometimes do, standing next to the narrator's partner, looking at them with large, constantly scanning eyes that felt, by every account, profoundly aware. The beak was crossed, the feathers were rough and worn-looking, but it was the eyes that got them. The narrator said it was the feeling you get when you look at an animal and you can see that it is thinking, not reacting, thinking. They tried to catch it to take it to a wildlife rehabilitator. It was too fast. Quick enough to stay just out of reach, but not fast enough to disappear. The second night brought more whistling. 2 short, sharp bursts this time, but with the same unmistakably human quality of tone. Rustling outside. Another sleepless vigil until dawn. The third evening, the roadrunner returned, and it did something that the narrator still struggles to describe. It ran about 10 feet ahead, stopped, turned around and looked directly at them with those enormous eyes, waited. When they got close enough, it ran again, 10 feet, stopped, looked back, waited. The narrator followed without fully realizing it, until they looked up and found that the sun was setting and they were standing in the foothills of the rock mountain behind the house. The bird had been leading them away from the house and toward the high ground, step by step, and they had been too focused on catching it to notice. They turned back. The bird followed and kept trying in its way to redirect them. They have never had a wild animal behave that way toward them. Not before, not since. On the final morning, as they loaded the car to leave, one of them found a single human footprint in the sand near the dumpster. No shoe, no boot, No trail of prints leading to it or away from it. Just one bare human footprint in the sand of a landscape where no one walks barefoot, where the ground is full of scorpions and spider holes and cactus spines and jagged rock. They looked into the area's history later. They read about the long tradition of skinwalker encounters in that part of the Mojave Desert. They say they knew nothing about that before they went. And if you've made it this far tonight, thank you. Truly. Each of these stories belongs to a real person who lived through something they could not explain, and choosing to share it takes a certain kind of courage. Wherever you are right now, whatever the hour, I hope these stories reminded you that the world is wider and stranger and more extraordinary than we can ever fully map. Like this video if these stories moved you, surprised you, or raised the hair on the back of your arms. Share it with a friend who loves a good mystery or a late-night story. And please, if you have experienced something you cannot explain, something in the woods, on a road, in the dark, write it in the comments. We are listening. Every single story matters. What do you think was guiding those girls through the dark in those Tennessee woods? What was whistling in the night at Joshua Tree? What was watching from the bushes in the Himalayas? Leave your thoughts below. I want to know. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. We'll be here tomorrow night, and we will always leave the light on for you. Good night, stay safe, and be careful about who or what you follow into the dark.